Rain trickled down the glass window of a small café, painting silver streaks against the dim glow of evening lights. Inside, the soft murmur of conversation mingled with the hum of an old espresso machine. At a corner table, near the frosted glass that blurred the busy street outside, sat a woman in her early 30s named Clara. Her hands cupped a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. She wasn't really drinking it, just holding it, as if its warmth might somehow seep through her palms and thaw the chill that had settled deep within her heart. Clara had come to this café every Friday for nearly a year. To the regulars, she was just another quiet face, someone who sat alone and stared too long at nothing. To the barista, she was, the usual, an order that required no words. But if anyone looked closely, if anyone had truly seen her, they might have noticed the faint redness in her eyes, the way her lips trembled as if holding back words she never spoke. Once, Clara had been full of laughter. She'd been an art teacher at the local school, loved by her students for the joy she carried into every class. That was before the accident, before her younger brother, Evan, was taken in a single, cruel moment on a wet highway. The car that hit him had never stopped. And from that day forward, neither had Clara's grief. It followed her everywhere, like a shadow she couldn't outwalk. This particular Friday was harder than most. It was Evan's birthday. She'd spent the morning at the cemetery, her hands trembling as she placed a single sunflower on the headstone, the kind he used to draw when he was little, always with a crooked stem and a bright, hopeful face. She'd whispered a few words she wasn't sure anyone heard, then walked away before the tears could start again. Now, in the café, surrounded by chatter that seemed to belong to another world, Clara sat in silence. Her eyes drifted to the door every time it opened, though she didn't know why. Maybe she was waiting for something, or someone, though she couldn't have said what. It was then that the stranger walked in. He looked out of place, not because of how he was dressed, but because of how he carried himself. His clothes were simple, a gray sweater, jeans, shoes still wet from the rain. His face bore the kind of lines that life draws on those who've listened more than they've spoken. He ordered a coffee, glanced around, and after a brief hesitation, chose the empty table across from Clara. For a while, nothing happened. The stranger sipped his drink, occasionally looking toward the window, lost in his own thoughts. Then, as if drawn by something invisible, his gaze met Clara's. She quickly looked away, embarrassed to have been caught staring. But the stranger's eyes weren't unkind, they were steady, calm, like someone who had known storms and survived them. A few minutes later, the café door opened again, letting in a gust of wind and a small group of laughing teenagers. One of them bumped into Clara's table, spilling her cold coffee. She startled, fumbling for napkins, her hands shaking. Before she could move, the stranger was already on his feet, handing her a few from his own table. "Here," he said softly. His voice was low and warm, like a familiar song. "Let me help." "Thank you," she murmured, avoiding his eyes as she dabbed at the spill. He nodded, then sat back down, but something in his expression lingered, an awareness, a quiet understanding. When the café grew a little less noisy, he spoke again, not unkindly, not intrusively. "Rough day?" he asked. Clara hesitated. Normally, she would have deflected, offered a polite smile and a dismissive, "I'm fine." But today, her guard was thinner than usual. The question, simple as it was, cracked something open inside her. She let out a breath that trembled. "You could say that," she said, her eyes fixed on the table. The stranger nodded, not pressing. He just waited, the kind of patience that invited honesty. "It's my brother's birthday," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but heavy. He's not here anymore." The stranger didn't look surprised. He simply listened, his eyes steady on her, his hands still. "I come here sometimes," she continued, unsure why she was talking to him at all. "It's silly, I know. But it's one of the few places I can sit and pretend for a little while. Like maybe he'll walk through that door, teasing me for being so serious all the time." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "He used to say I frowned too much. Said it made me look like an old teacher instead of a young one." Her words caught in her throat. The stranger didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty comfort or platitudes. He simply sat there, his silence gentle and open, making space for hers. "I keep thinking," she said after a pause, "that if I had just called him that night, maybe he would have stayed home. Maybe." Her voice broke. She pressed a hand over her mouth, the tears coming fast now. The stranger reached across the table, not to touch her, but to place a small, folded napkin within her reach. It was such a simple gesture, but it was exactly what she needed. When she finally looked up, he spoke for the first time in a long while. "I lost my daughter," he said quietly. 2 years ago. She was 16. Clara blinked, surprised by his openness. "I used to sit in places like this too," he went on. "I thought if I just stayed quiet enough, the world would forget to hurt me. But it doesn't work that way." He looked at her, not with pity, but with shared understanding. Sometimes the only way through it is to let someone else sit with the silence too. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle. The hum of conversation faded into the background. "What was her name?" Clara asked softly. "Lila," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "She loved to paint. Our living room walls are still covered in her work, sunsets, birds, a cat she insisted looked like me." Clara smiled weakly through her tears. "Evan used to draw sunflowers. Hundreds of them. My fridge looked like a field of yellow." "Then maybe," the stranger said, "somewhere, they're comparing notes." The thought made her laugh, an unsteady, unexpected sound that warmed the air between them. They talked a little more after that. Not about the past, but about small things. The smell of rain. The sound of trains at night. The way grief changes shape but never really leaves. Each word seemed to loosen something inside Clara, like knots slowly unraveling. When it was time to go, the stranger stood, finishing his coffee. "Take care of yourself," he said gently. "And keep coming here. Even when it hurts." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. He hesitated at the door. "My name's Daniel," he added. "Clara," she said quietly. He smiled once, then stepped out into the rain. For a few minutes, Clara just sat there, watching the droplets slide down the windowpane. When she finally looked at her table, she noticed the napkin he had given her earlier. On it, in neat handwriting, were 4 simple words, "You're not alone anymore." She didn't know why, but those words felt like sunlight after a long winter. She folded the napkin carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Over the next few weeks, she returned to the café, as she always did. But this time, something had shifted. She began noticing things, the laughter of strangers, the scent of coffee, the way rain sounded softer when it hit the roof. She even brought her sketchbook again, though the pages had been blank for months. One Friday, she found herself sketching a sunflower. The lines were shaky, uncertain. But it was a start. She smiled faintly, whispering, "You'd like this one, Evan." A few minutes later, someone cleared their throat beside her. She looked up. Daniel was standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need a refill," he said. Her smile widened, genuine this time. "Thank you." He sat down, setting 1 cup in front of her. "I was just passing by," he said casually. But it felt wrong not to stop in. They talked again, and again the next week, and the week after that. Their conversations weren't always about loss. Sometimes they were about books, or old movies, or the stray cat that had started haunting the café's doorway. But underneath it all was something unspoken, a shared understanding that didn't need explaining. As winter melted into spring, Clara began teaching again. It wasn't easy at first. The classroom felt haunted by memories, but the children's laughter slowly brought life back to her. One day, she brought in a canvas and told her students they were going to paint sunflowers, not perfect ones, but the kind that leaned toward the light even when it rained. That afternoon, when the children's paintings covered the classroom walls, she took a picture and sent it to Daniel. He replied simply, they'd both be proud. Months passed. Life didn't suddenly become easy, but it became livable. And that was something Clara had once thought impossible. Sometimes, when the world grew quiet, she'd think back to that first night, the rain, the silence, the stranger who stayed to listen. She realized that he hadn't said much. He hadn't tried to fix her pain or tell her it would go away. He'd simply been there, holding space for her grief until she could breathe again. And in doing so, he'd reminded her of something she'd forgotten, that kindness doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a stranger's patience, a listening ear, a few words on a napkin that say, "You're not alone." Years later, Clara found herself sitting in that same café once more, though the place had changed. The walls were brighter, the chairs newer, but the essence remained. Across from her sat a young woman, eyes red, hands trembling around a cup of untouched tea. Clara listened as the girl spoke of loss, her voice breaking in the same place as Clara's once had. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply stayed and listened. When the girl finally wiped her tears, Clara reached for a napkin, wrote 4 familiar words, and slid it across the table. The girl read it, her eyes softening with gratitude. And outside, as the rain began to fall once more, Clara smiled. The kindness that had once saved her had found its way forward again, like sunlight through clouds, like a stranger who stayed just long enough to remind her that no one truly heals alone.